Hey, everybody. It's time once again for another one of my sparkling presentations. Anyway, we're going on to chapter 24 in sociology, collective behavior and social movements. Got a quote, Maynard? I always got a quote. This is an African American schoolgirl explaining why she was joining the Selma, Alabama Civil Rights March in 1965. She said, "For freedom and justice, and so the troopers can't hit us anymore." Margaret Mead said, "Do not make the mistake of thinking that a concerned group of people cannot change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." Now, interestingly, liberals believe that. However, conservatives who favor traditional hierarchy, elites, and individualism would say it's great people that cause change, not ordinary groups of people. I'd say it's both. Sometimes great people cause change, and as we've seen with all kinds of social movements, obviously ordinary people cause change too. Collective behavior is on page 636. You need to understand what it is and what are its various forms. Collective behavior is activity involving a large number of people that is unplanned, often controversial, and sometimes dangerous. It is complex and difficult to study for three reasons. One, collective behavior is diverse, and so it's difficult to tie together all the different types, which include fads, rumors, mob behavior, and so forth. So it's very diverse. Two, collective behavior is variable. Why do some rumors go viral while others never take hold? And three, much collective behavior is transitory. Sociologists tend to focus on the continuing parts of society, not fads, disasters, or rumors which come and go. Okay, the term collective behavior, by the way, was coined by sociologist Robert Park, who defined sociology as the science of collective behavior. This suggests that sociology should focus on dynamic rather than stable social patterns. Alrighty. While interest in the field of collective behavior has tended to wax and wane in response to the level of movement activity in society, right now it is waxing. It has been studied in more earnest since the vast array of social movements in the 1960s. In fact, as we go through the different theories on collective behavior, you'll see that most of them evolved in the 60s and the 70s as a result of studying all the worldwide movements that were going on in the 60s. Unprecedented in human history. Okay, on page 637, a collectivity is defined as a large number of people whose minimal interaction occurs in the absence of well-defined and conventional norms. Now, you can break this down further into localized collectivities and dispersed collectivities. Localized collectivities are illustrated by crowds, mobs, and riots, whereas dispersed collectivities are exemplified by rumors, public opinion, fads, and fashion. Collectivities are distinguished by one, limited social interaction, two, unclear social boundaries, three, weak and unconventional norms. Collectivities then are not like groups because groups have the force of tradition behind them, whereas collectivities are not guided by culture in such a straightforward way. So sociology is generally the study of the ordinary organization of social life. In one sense, collective behavior is the study of the extraordinary. Okay, some examples of collectivities. Crowds. Crowds is a temporary gathering of people who share a common focus of attention and whose members influence one another. In the late 19th century, 1800s, Gustave Le Bon said, "The age we are about to enter in will in truth be the era of crowds." Boy, was he right. Sociologist Herbert Blumer in 1969 identified four types of crowds, basically defined by their level of social interaction and emotional intensity. So you have casual crowds, which involve little, if any, interaction. For example, a crowd at a beach or a college classroom when the professor said, "So, does anybody have any questions?" when it's 2 minutes before the class ends. Everybody look at it. No, we don't have any questions. Seriously, we want to get out of here. That's a casual crowd. Conventional crowds, usually the result of deliberate planning, interaction conforms to appropriate norms. For example, you're sitting in the classroom and you're hanging on my every word of my presentation. See, I hate to call them lectures, I call them my presentations. Expressive crowd forms around an event with emotional appeal to participants. It's spontaneous, it's exhilarating behavior. For example, after the recent election, you saw there were spontaneous celebrations all over the United States as people were celebrating Biden and Harris's victory. Four, acting crowds driven by an intense, single-minded purpose, powerful emotions that could erupt into mob violence. Well, we've seen this with some of the Black Lives Matter protests, which started out peaceful, but then there were folks who may not have been associated with them all that it erupted into violent behavior. I remember in 1993, a crowd at a football game was so excited because the university, this is at the University of Wisconsin, they were so excited because they finally beat the University of Michigan that the crowd just rushed onto the field and a couple of people got injured, seriously injured, and if I remember correctly, even killed accidentally as they got kind of trampled. So here was an expressive crowd that ended up being an acting crowd. Now, other sociologists have added to the list protest crowds engage in actions that have political goals. They vary in emotional intensity, often according to the reactions to their actions, which is a key point in community organizing. I teach a course on this very thing, how to organize people to take action in issues. And a key point is you always have to figure out, if we do this, what is the opposition going to do in response? So it's like a chess match, and you have to think it out several steps ahead so you're prepared for the reaction of your action. Mobs, a highly emotional crowd that pursues some violent or destructive goal. In fact, it's from the Latin mobile vulgus, meaning the movable or changeable common people. It can erupt from an acting crowd turning violent, and it typically has leaders. Norms are totally violated, and behavior of the mob is unpredictable. For example, when we're in the classroom and I hand back the first cumulative exam results, it's often a mob forms and waits for me after class. In the text, lynch mobs were described. Unfortunately, racial violence has a long history in the United States and generally involved white attacks on blacks, Asians, and Native Americans. This pattern of African Americans riot against whites emerged only in the 1960s. In the 1980s, the frequency of white attacks on blacks began to increase. Riots. Riot is from the Latin word meaning to roar, and it was actually used in medieval Europe to refer to a dispute was a riot. A lot of times people say, "Maynard, you're a riot." Not a lot of times. In fact, never. A riot is a social eruption that is highly emotional, violent, and undirected. It's typically a leaderless, purposeless, violent crowd with the violence directed at persons or property. While sparked by some incident, riots are usually the result of long-standing anger and serve as collective expressions of social injustice. So, for example, if you go back into the long history of the persecution of African Americans living in, I'm just going to look at the North, forget about how bad it was in the South with segregation, but where the job of the white police force was to contain blacks into their inner city neighborhoods. That's long standing, uh, uh, anger and hatred building up. And so a catalyst takes place, and all this long-standing anger and tension builds that is built up just explodes into a riot. As noted in the text, sometimes riots can result from positive feelings, like when the semester's over. Well, how do we explain crowd behavior? The first theory to attempt to do so was developed by Gustave Le Bon, who I just gave you a quote from, in 1895. And his theory was called contagion theory, like contagious. His theory is that people relinquish their individuality and get caught up in a collective mind, almost in a hypnotic way. Characterized by anonymity, suggestibility, and emotional contagion, this irrational crowd behavior typically results in violence. He said, what constituted a people, a unity, a whole, becomes in the end an agglomeration of individualities lacking cohesion. So his point is, hey, people in the midst of a crowd, they're anonymous. And so, well, they were more anonymous in the past. Now with video cameras everywhere, they're not so anonymous. But anyway, he said, so people will do things they would never do individually because they got caught up in a crowd and figure they can get away with stuff, or they get caught up in the collective crowd mind, and so they lose their individuality. The critique of his approach is his ideas were based on common assumptions not backed by research. Recent research has found that crowds, even in panic situations, are still composed of the thoughts and intentions of their individual members, which kind of makes sense. I mean, any crowd is composed of the collective thoughts of its individual members. There was a Who concert panic in 1979, and Norris Johnson, who researched it, said perhaps there are situations such as a fire in a crowded theater, in which people totally ignore others as they try to escape from danger, or sadly, as we've seen, shootings in theaters. However, documented cases are surprisingly rare in the literature. In 1974, Burke came up with convergence theory. This reverses the causal link of contagion theory and saying rather than the crowd creating the motivation, it's motivation that creates the crowd. In other words, like-minded individuals are drawn together by some common attitude or interest. So you would have Trump supporters, or you would have anti-Trump supporters, or you would have white supremacists, or you would have those opposing white supremacists. So the argument here is that what draws these people together is they all have a common cause to address. The similarity of the actions in the crowd then is more a consequence of the commonality of characteristics of the individuals than a creation of the character itself. Behaviors are not irrational, but the result of rational, purposeful decision making. So we've seen in some of the gatherings of like the groups, the Proud Boys, they're going to come heavily armed. Well, it was all predictable because that's what they're all about. The critique is you can't totally discount the probability that people will do things in a crowd context that they wouldn't do acting on their own. Okay, on page 640, you need to know about emergent norm theory. This has kind of been the one that's more widely accepted. This is developed by Turner and Killian in 1993. They agree with convergence theory in most respects, but feel that no crowd can be completely understood as the convergence of like-minded individuals. Particularly in expressive acting and protest crowds, norms emerge as the situation proceeds that guides the crowd's behavior. Typically, these norms are initiated by a few leaders and are quickly adopted by others, resulting in mildly erratically unconventional behaviors. Therefore, collective, contextually rational goals from the crowd emerge as the situation unfolds. Get it? Emergent norms. What are the norms? They emerge. Nobody knows going in what's going to happen. Now, as you can see, this is a symbolic interaction approach because you're creating the situation as it's unfolding. So you could be in a crowd and it's a protest crowd, and all of a sudden somebody says, "That's it, let's go to the administration building." All right, then all of a sudden the crowd goes. Now some will and some won't. They won't necessarily all follow that. And who are the leaders? It just happens. Somebody yells it out. Okay, that's a leader, and some people follow. Turner and Killian said, usually the judgment that someone has acted irrationally is made in hindsight or by someone who is not in the situation of the actor and thus has a different perspective. Turner and Killian also point out that not everyone in the crowd embraces the emerging norms as fully as others. Some are leaders, some are followers with varying levels of commitment, and some in the crowd will oppose the norms that are emerging. Well, the critique of this approach is that emergent norm theory strikes a balance between contagion theory and convergence theory. Crowd behavior does reflect the desires of the participants, but it's also guided by norms that emerge as the situation develops. So this last one, emergent norm theory, is the more commonly accepted one that most people lean on theoretically to explain crowd behavior. Mass behavior. So far, we have looked at the collective behavior of people in physical proximity to one another, localized collectivities. Mass behavior refers to collective behavior among people dispersed over a wide geographical area. It could be across the nation, it could be around the world. Forms of mass behavior. Rumor. Rumor is unsubstantiated information spread informally, often by word of mouth or Twitter now. It thrives in a climate of ambiguity about the actual facts of a situation. It is unstable and variable in content, and rumor is difficult to stop. Trump has built much of his presidency on rumor. So he will tweet things that have no basis in fact because they get fact checked and then, oh, that's not true. But nevertheless, the rumor gets around and people buy into it. One of his most famous approaches to this, and this is something he learned a long time ago, is he'll start out with, "I heard people say," or "some people claim." Now, at best, this is some crazy theory somebody has, or at best, nobody ever actually said that. So he'll say that, and then people think, "Oh, it must be true because he says some people say that." No, nobody said that. He just said that to cast doubt in their minds as to what's actually happening. I remember back in the 60s, there was this theory that Paul McCartney had died, and everybody found all these clues indicating it was true. Of course, none of it was true, including the album cover where he's walking out of step as he's crossing Abbey Road. Anyway, none of it was true, but people pieced it all together and said it's true. Hey, you can piece together any assortment of incidents and make the claim it's a conspiracy. Not to say there aren't some. I'm just saying people can make them up real easily too. Here's one of my favorite little experiments that was done. In 1987, Levin and Arlucchi spread a rumor on their campus by widely distributing flyers announcing a fictitious wedding. Okay, here's a flyer. This wedding's about to take place. The flyers were purposely circulated only one day before the supposed event, the wedding. Nevertheless, the researchers found that 1 week later, 52% of the campus heard of the wedding. And here's the best part. 12% of the people claimed to have actually attended the wedding, which of course didn't exist. Now, that would have been fun to be a follow-up researcher. So what was the bride wearing? I wasn't there. Where she went? Well, she was resplendent in white and how about the party afterward? How'd that go? Oh, it's crazy. You should have been there. Oh. Um, Delbert Miller claimed that in 1945, only a small number of people on his campus learned of the death of President Roosevelt directly from radio reports. Within 30 minutes, however, 90% of the American people have been informed by word of mouth. Obviously, today's more powerful mass media reduced the significance of of mouth in spreading a national rumor. Okay, next form of mass behavior is gossip. Gossip is rumor about the personal affairs of others. It is more localized than rumor and can be positive or negative. Um, so, rumors abound with everything, and it's a key to magazines such as People Magazine or Us Magazine, or what the heck are some of those shows that appear where they talk about the stars, and we're not talking about astrology, but they give you gossip behind the scenes. Did you know? Or some of the, like the National Enquirer, some of those ridiculous weekly magazines or weekly papers that come out. So, yeah, it's lots of gossip. And the fact that we're actually interested is the most amazing thing at all. Like, you really do care what the Kardashians are doing, and now you can follow them around. You can follow them around on their blog and see what they're doing every day. And why would you care? I mean, don't you think it's kind of a sad commentary on you that you're actually interested, that you have to live voyeuristically through them? Just throwing it out there. And don't get me started on the Queen. They have an entire magazine and dedicated reporters just to report on what's happening with the royal family in England. It's that interesting to the people of England. Well, Levinon Arluki, who I mentioned before with emergent norm theory, said to regard gossip as idle chatter is to underestimate its usefulness. By making some people insiders, gossip may serve the social needs of other directed people. Well, it's true. It's sort of like, guess what? Guess what I heard about somebody? Do tell. Well, see, don't you feel the power? You know something they don't know. Another form of mass behavior is public opinion, widespread attitudes toward controversial issues. In industrial society, interest in these issues blows hot and cold. Social elites, even though they are a small number of people, exert enormous influence on the public's opinion on issues. Powerful special interest groups use propaganda to shape this public opinion. Regarding propaganda, all governments use propaganda for a wide range of goals. In the 1930s, for example, the United States government created something of a moral panic in order to enact the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Help from Hollywood came in the form of the film Reefer Madness. Now, if you never saw Reefer Madness, it's really hilarious because they were trying to scare the hell out of the public about the dangers of marijuana. I mean, watching it now, it's just ridiculously funny because it's so inaccurate in its information, but it scared the hell out of everybody. And as a result, the Marijuana Tax Act got passed in 1937 because of the dangers of marijuana. Ah! Let's see. Mark Twain, remember, comedian, he said, public opinion in this country is everything. It's the only critic whose opinion is worth anything at all. Okay, now throughout this course, I don't know if you noticed that I've been sarcastically commenting whenever I give you a public opinion survey and I go, and 6% didn't know. Now, it could be no response, but I prefer didn't know, because it's fodder for some of my humor. But interestingly, a significant proportion of US citizens have no opinion about many seemingly personally relevant issues. For example, here was a question asked: Should authorities prevent parents from showing pornographic films to their 10-year-old child, let alone to each other? 17% had no opinion. Well, probably figuring, hey, the kid's got to learn somewhere. They don't tell them much in high school. All they tell them in the fifth and sixth grade health classes, don't have sex. So maybe it's better the kid sees some porn. Don't worry. See, you don't have to show the kid porn anymore. The kid can just find it on any website. Does the average person influence government decisions? 8% had no opinion. Yeah, I don't know. It's such a crapshoot. Is the world getting better? 19% had no opinion. Flip a coin. Better, worse. What do you think? Is there a life after death? 8% had no opinion. I don't know. What's this got to do with me? These are probably people who don't have a life in this life. Okay, next form of mass behavior is panic and mass hysteria. Panic is a form of localized collective behavior by which people react to a threat or other stimulus with emotional, irrational, and often self-destructive behavior. For example, the college announces a tuition increase. Or the college requires you from now on, you have to eat in the Canova Commons. Let's see, what else do I got here? Mass hysteria is a form of dispersed collective behavior by which people react to a real or imagined event with irrational, frantic behavior. Fear in a crowd is often contagious and escalating as hysteria feeds on itself. Now get this, the Greek root word hystero means uterus. This reveals the historic association of irrational behavior and women. Yeah, that women are irrational and emotional. There was mass hysteria regarding the witches in colonial Massachusetts. Remember the burning the witches? Most witches were women. Most witches were women, often women who did not conform to conventional definitions of femininity, and sometimes they were landowners, which was, only white males who owned land could vote and so forth. So these women were threatening, to the males at the time. And so as soon as they became threatening because they weren't taking no crap from no male, they were labeled a witch. Today we call them a biatch. And the contrary would be biatch, prick. Disasters is an event generally unexpected that causes harm to people and damages property. Fashions and fads, another form of mass behavior. Fashion is a social pattern favored for a time by a large number of people. It is typically a transitory phenomenon, and fashions often recycle. Now, you're going to have to Google this, but I'm still waiting for Nehru jackets to come back in style. Nehru jackets. You will see the Beatles wearing some Nehru jackets. Bell bottoms came back briefly. Long hair never went out. Tie-dyes continue to be in. Yves Saint Laurent said, fashions fade. Style is eternal. Georg Simmel, the sociologist, said, fashion is a product of class distinction. Points out that people use fashion to craft their presentation of self in pursuit of approval and prestige. Well, I know, you can see what a clothes horse I am. And a lot of people come up to me and say, Maynard, you're quite the fashionista. Can you give us some tips on what are the fall colors? Well, let me look outside. Look like they're red, brown, yellow. To me, it's almost hilarious that there's actually such a thing as the new fall colors. Like, really? Fad is an unconventional social pattern that people embrace briefly but enthusiastically. Fads often depend upon the acceptance by high prestige people, and they come and go quickly. Whereas fashions reflect cultural values and tend to evolve over time. So to summarize collective behavior, think back. I know this was in the previous exam, but do you remember Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. The Ash and the Milgram experiments, remember Milgram's electric shock experiments, demonstrate people's susceptibility to pressure to conform. Similarly, collective behavior generates pressure toward conformity. Next, social movements, organized activity that encourages or discourages social change. You go, what do you mean discourages social change? Think about the term conservatism. Conservatives seek to maintain the way things are, or to harken back to a time when they felt America was in a better place. Typically, it's the late 50s. C. Wendell King said social movements and their goals represent, respectively, actual and potential social change. Social movements are deliberate and consequential forms of collective behavior designed to promote or resist some dimension of social change. They are characterized by a high degree of internal organization. They last longer than other forms of collective behavior, and they seek to reorganize or defend the societal status quo in some way. They are far more common now than they were in the past. Many social movements fall into one of two categories: equality movements seeking social equality for various categories of people, whether based on class, race, sexual orientation, and so forth, or specific protest movements targeting gun control, nuclear power, animal experimentation, and so forth, like the animal rights movement. Okay, check out figure 24-4 on page 646. It's on the exam. It shows four types of social movements: alternative, redemptive, reformative, and revolutionary. Regarding revolutionary social movements, here's a quote from two wacky guys who learned to know and love: Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They said, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. Sean O'Casey said, you cannot put a rope around the neck of an idea. Which reminds me of another quote. Guess who said this quote? You cannot defeat an ideology with an army. In order to defeat an ideology, you have to come up with a superior ideology. Guess who said that? Could it be Hitler? Indeed it was. Okay, so in looking at the four dimensions of social movements, you will see that one of the dimensions in this typology is breadth. Are we trying to change just some people or everyone in the country? A second dimension is depth. Are we trying to change some aspects of life within the current social system, or are we trying to make fundamental changes in the system itself? Theorists Joan Fitzgerald and Louise Simmons pointed out that operationalizing the success of any social movement cannot be limited to immediate effects. It must also assess the movement's contribution to future social change. I'll give you a great example. The major social movements of the 1960s were revolutionary social movements in that they sought to transform society. Now, why I point this out is because, following up on what the two theorists just said, is at the time we naively thought that we could immediately change everything, that we change the whole structure of society. The only thing that there was immediate change, and even that took 10, 15 years, was the Vietnam War. And as the protests against the Vietnam War continued, more and more people joined it. And so initially it was just college students protesting it, but later on there was mom and dad and even grandpa protesting the war as the public opinion supporting the war dropped off dramatically. So if you go back into the beginning of the protest movements in the middle 60s, you will see that most people in America favored the Vietnam War. But part of the reason why you organize is to educate the public as to your thinking. And so, as the protests continued and people began to see what the real truth of the war was in Vietnam, more and more people began to oppose it. And by the end of the war, most of Americans opposed it. And that's why you saw such a wide variety of people protesting in the streets against the Vietnam War. Speaking of the 60s, Robin Williams said, anyone who can remember the 60s probably wasn't there. You know, and the mere fact that I can still teach a course in the 60s show there's some thoughts still there. But you know, to give you another one of Maynard's amazing anecdotes, you know, here we go again. Once the comedy sorbet to cleanse the intellectual palate before we move on. So I remember, not much, but I remember some. So I remember I was teaching at Muhlenberg as an adjunct at my alma mater. And you can imagine, you know, having graduated with my mighty 2.3 GPA, when the very faculty who taught me saw me come back 15 years later to teach in that department. But they did remember I got all A's in sociology. So anyway, um, you know, I'd be telling stories about the frat days, you know, and so forth when I was at Muhlenberg, because, you know, the students, the class, the same frat. Well, my frat's not there anymore. It got disbanded pretty quickly after we left. But anyway, the fraternity system was still alive. One of the students would chuckle away at all the stories and stuff. And so they thought it would be kind of interesting to go to my mentor in sociology and see if they could get any tidbits on Maynard. And so they came back to me and they said, hey, we asked Professor so and so, we asked him, you know, about you in the 60s. And he said, you always had this glazed look over your eyes in class. And I thought, So I decided to feign anger and confront him on this. And I said, Frank, I said, I understand you told the students when they asked you what I was like in the 60s, they always had this glazed look over my eyes. And he said, oh, yes, I did say that. He said, but the full context was I also said, but you always seemed to know what was going on. And he said, I didn't mean to offend you. And I said, wasn't offended at all. I said, I'm just glad to hear I was in class. I have no recollection of it whatsoever. But I do remember the partying. Woo. Yeah, man. I was in an Animal House fraternity, and I was also in a cycle gang. And we get the cycle gang to join the Animal House fraternity for parties that were legendary on campus. Okay. The explanation, there are 7 explanations of social movements that you need to know for the exam, and I will go over them with you. The first is on page 647, deprivation theory. Deprivation theory was developed in 1978 and added on to in 1982. The theory here is that social movements arise when large numbers of people feel deprived of things they consider necessary to their well-being. It's relative in that it's a perceived disadvantage based on comparisons with what other people have or what people expect they should have, that it's unfair for them to not have what others have. This is what Merton's strain theory was all about. I know you'll remember when he said that people, for example, low-income people in America see what the rest of America has and they feel deprived that they don't have the same things these people have. So then they feel that social strain and then they react in ways like maybe they'll steal or whatever to because they want to be like everybody else. It's related to the theory of rising expectations and can especially set in with a sudden stop or turnabout in improved conditions. So, for example, if you see, I don't know, if you're in a workplace and you see that you've steadily gotten raises, and then all of a sudden things go south at the workplace and they tell you there ain't going to be any raises this year. In fact, you're going to get a 10% pay cut. That's even worse than if you hadn't gotten raises up until now, you know, because you have rising expectations. Well, the critique of this approach is there are four criticisms. One is, this is the main one, is that within any society, some discontent is likely at times within all segments of society. Yet this doesn't necessarily erupt into a social movement. So that's the main critique. So this suggests, the theory suggests that, when people are dissatisfied, it's going to be result in a social movement. You know, look at Marx and Engels' theory about people being dissatisfied with capitalism, and that the workers would be dissatisfied with it. It would lead to revolution. Well, they may be dissatisfied, but there hasn't been a revolution yet. Page 647, the next one you need to know is mass society theory developed by Kornhauser in 1959. Social movements are formed by people who feel socially isolated and personally insignificant within the masses of large, complex societies. Just think about the term mass society. Okay, so what happens? You feel anonymous, you know? It's like millions of people in New York City and you're just one person. You feel kind of like you lost your individuality. These people are not well integrated into society. They feel powerless, and social movements offer them the opportunity to escape from their intolerable isolation and not so much to change society. Excuse me. Prone to deviance, these people are easily manipulated by leaders. Well, it's hardly a social movement, but this would account for terrorists. They feel isolated. You know, my theory is not unique to me, but the theory I subscribe to is I think everybody here wants to make a difference. Everybody comes into this life wanting to make a difference. And sometimes their lives are such that there's no way they can see that they can make a positive difference, you know, through their jobs or whatever. And so they think they're making a positive difference by committing an act of terrorism, that they're carrying out God's will or Allah's will or whatever. And so they do. And so, you know, we would see it as a horribly negative thing, but they would see it as their opportunity to make a positive difference. Again, I'm going to throw this out to you. What the mystics argue is that everything we do is motivated by love. And it's something you have to think really deeply about, and think about all the acts you've seen take place and think about what would motivate that person out of love to do it. Because it could be love of the cause, it could be love of self, it could be love of money. But, you know, the argument is that love motivates everything we do, even when we do things out of fear, because fear is just a manifestation of love. Fear is, the ultimate fear is not having love. Okay, so this is similar to Hirsch's control theory of deviance in that the behavior in question arises among those with few social attachments. So remember Hirsch's theory on deviance, all the other theories on deviance said, well, how can we account for people misbehaving? And he said, that's crazy. The way to look at it is, why should people want to behave? You know, we have to learn to behave growing up. And he said, especially people who have nothing to lose, they'll do crazy ass stuff. Richard Farson said, as with every other revolutionary movement, the leadership paradoxically is likely to come from the least oppressed and marginal members of the population, or from people outside the group completely. You know, and I noticed this happens even today, but back in the 60s, whenever there were protests going on among the college students, the government would say it was inspired by outside communist agitators. Yeah, as in our kids themselves could be protesting against what we do, could they? Yeah, they could. And even today, I'll see that. They'll say, well, you know, Black Lives Matters, and then they'll say there were outside agitators. And I'm fully supportive of the BLM movement. I'm saying that they come in peacefully, but then there are outside people who do the rioting, you know, and has nothing to do with them. Or the claim by the Trump administration with some of the protests that turned into riots in Portland and in Seattle, was that it was outside agitators, in this case Antifa, that, you know, inspired that rioting. So Kornhauser's conservative approach to social movements follows from the implication that it is the loss of traditional social ties and not social inequality that leads to social movements. Kornhauser opposed Marxist theories and favored class movements who favored class movements, and instead Kornhauser favored mass movements. If you go back further in history, I've often referred to Alexis de Tocqueville's 1840 work, Democracy in America. He too favored mass movements. Well, the critique of this approach is, how do we measure when enough people constitute a mass society? In other words, the argument is when we have mass societies, we're going to have these disgruntled, isolated people who are going to do some crazy stuff. So when do we reach that critical point? When do we reach, whoop, whoop, we are now at mass society. Beware, beware. Also, a well-integrated society seems positive and yet may have pronounced social injustices and inequalities. So some research supports mass society theory, and other research downplays the notion that flawed people, not a flawed society, create social movements. So in other words, mass society movement kind of lets society off the hook. So it's not that society's all messed up or that there's grave injustices in society. It's just some crazy ass people. Carol Miller said, psychological attributes of individuals such as frustration and alienation have minimal direct impact for explaining the occurrence of rebellion and revolution per se. Next theory, page 650, structural strain theory developed by Smeltzer. Remember Smeltzer? Yes. Anyway, he said, the more likely the following 6 factors are present, the more likely a social movement will form. These 6 factors are exemplified in the text to the pro-democracy movement in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. As I run through them, I'm going to use these 6 factors to the women's movement. So first factor is structural conduciveness. The roots of social movements lie in significant problems that beset a society. So in the case of the women's movement, you have the historical patterns of hierarchy and patriarchy, and women finally have the opportunity to organize in opposition. So that's important too, because the way you have to have the opportunity, because if you look at a place like communist China, you don't see a lot of protests because they don't have the opportunity to do so. Or even in Hong Kong, which is controlled by China, they allowed the protests to go just so far, and now they've cracked down on all of them. Structural strain is the second stage. There has to be failure to meet the expectations of people due to perceived relative deprivation and other forms of social strain. Well, in the case of the women's movement, the strain generated by the contradiction between the U.S. ideal of equality and the reality of patriarchy, and that women couldn't even vote in terms of the first stage of the women's movement. Third stage, growth and spread of an explanation. Effective social movements need a clearly articulated statement of a problem, its causes, and likely causes. This enables people to express their dissatisfaction in an organized manner. So there was early feminist scholarship and organization around the year 1840, and the convention at Seneca Falls, New York, where women began to challenge the structure of society where women lacked equality and at that time couldn't even vote. The next stage is precipitating factors. Precipitating factors. A specific event transforms long simmering discontent into collective action. So the first wave of feminism was generated by the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that extended rights to vote to African American men, but ignored women of both races. The second wave of feminism in the 1960s was fueled by the Black civil rights movement and the increasing proportion of women in the workforce. 5, now, one of the catalysts, one of the famous catalysts for the women's movement in the 60s was, and I've seen that this actually never happened, at least the original event never happened, but what hippies were doing to protest the draft, at the time was the law was you had to carry your draft card with you at all times. And so they would get, reporters around and announce they were about to do this. And so they would have a 55-gallon drum and they'd have a fire in it, and they would just be taking their cards and burning and throwing in there. Now, this was a technique Gandhi used when he was in South Africa. Before he organized in India, he organized in South Africa. So he was organizing Indians there who were told that they had to carry around this identification card that the rest of South Africans didn't have to carry. So they burned their identification cards. So the hippies picked up on that tactic and used it. So similarly, one of the catalysts for the women's movement was supposedly a woman did the same thing. She organized it and she burned her bra, and then other women burned their bras too. Now, supposedly this actually never happened. This was a figment of a reporter's imagination. But then later on, after this was produced, or was talked about, even though it never actually happened, then some women actually did it. I guess the women at the time didn't feel that wearing a bra was a very uplifting experience. I'll move on. Fifth factor in the chronology here of the movement. Then comes mobilization for action. Widespread concern about a public issue sets the stage for collective action. So organizations in the second wave of feminism, such as the National Organization for Women NOW, and there was widespread publication of feminist ideas. For example, Ms. Magazine came out in 1972. Ms. Magazine, the first issue totally sold out. It just wowed women. It's just what they were waiting for. Now, the National Organization for Women has not been looked favorably upon by some uber conservatives who refer to it as the National Organization of Witches. 6, then comes lack of social control. The responses of society's established authorities largely determines the outcome of any social movement. So again, it's not so much what people do, it's the response of the authorities. Obviously, you were trying to make a change. So for example, with the 60s, I guess a point I forgot to make earlier was things didn't change all at once. But now you look at it, about 70 years, 60 years later, look at the changes in culture that are all the things that people fought for in the 60s. The women's movement, the LGBT movement, plus movement, gays now have the right to marry. So you have same-sex marriages that was, unheard of even 15 years ago. Then the argument was at best you're going to have civil unions. Look at how the culture has changed in terms of the embrace of things like meditation and new age thinking, and marijuana is now legalized. It's been the ascent of minorities. Not that we don't have a long way to go, but look how influential minorities were in the past election. So all these things that we fought for in the 60s have come to pass. It just took a lot longer than everybody thought. So in terms of lack of social control and applying it to the women's movement, you have congressional passage of the 19th Amendment, which temporarily slowed the women's movement. The ERA was never fully ratified. It came up one state short, but much legislation has advanced women's social and economic rights. Well, the critique of this approach is what constitutes social strain. So in other words, all this happens when we've reached social strain level. Well, what constitutes that? The only evidence of it appears to be the emergence of the social movement itself. The theory also overlooks key factors such as the role of resources in establishing and sustaining a social movement. For example, the use of mass media or alliances to create a broader social movement. So again, for all these theories, you need to know the theory as well as the criticism of it for the exam. Next theory you need to know is on page 649, resource mobilization theory. The argument here is for a social movement to be successful, it must attract resources. Get it? Resources, and then you mobilize them. Resource mobilization theory. So Would that involve resources? You got it. So you have to mobilize people to action by building coalitions. So in organizing, there's your group, but then you want a broader group because it'll have more impact. So for example, look at the coalitions that came together in order to elect Biden and Harris. It was a broad-based coalition of minorities to make that happen, along with white people to make that happen. In this sense, outsiders are as important as insiders to the success of a movement. Without these resources, efforts toward intentional change will likely be frustrated. Discontent is a necessary condition for a social movement, but it is not enough for the movement to succeed. You need resources. Well, the critique of this approach is that even relatively powerless people, like the blacks in the civil rights movement, can still promote successful social movements with the effective organization of committed members. This theory may also overstate the willingness of those with resources, which are the powerful, to commit themselves to challenging the status quo through a social movement. It's kind of interesting because, for example, I think I mentioned previously in a presentation that there was a group, gosh, what the heck were they called? But anyway, it was a bunch of millionaires and even billionaires who were all supporting Biden because they believed that it was necessary, and they called themselves, they felt themselves to be quite the patriots because they believed it was necessary to raise taxes on the wealthy. So these are rich and powerful people who are willing to give up some of their resources in the interest of what they feel is social justice. Okay, the next movement you need to know, which was developed in the 1980s, is found on page 651. It's New Social Movements Theory. These develop in post-industrial societies primarily as a reaction to the power of the state, the government, in people's lives. De Tocqueville said, "I assert that there is no country in Europe in which the public administration has not become not only more centralized, but more inquisitive and more minute. It everywhere interferes in private concerns more than it did." Well, he said that in the 1840s. Can you imagine what he'd think now about how the government snoops in our lives and how you're on Facebook and Facebook sells all your personal data to other companies. That's how they make money. So goodbye privacy if you're participating on a social media platform. The focus of these new social movements are quality of life issues, not economic issues. So most of the previous social movements, not all, but often revolved around economic issues. I can remember in the 1960s, there was the Poor People's Movement, for example. But these aren't. These new social movements are not based on economic issues. And they're generally, they're generally international in scope. So for example, climate change, global ecology, women's, gay rights movements, animal rights movements, anti-war movements are global. Working class people tend to support economic issues, but these new social movements tend to be supported disproportionately from the middle and upper class and are based more on symbolism than class interests. So in other words, it kind of makes sense, like who for the most part would protest about economic issues? It would be those who have not. So again, these movements aren't about economic issues, so they're typically supported by middle and upper income people. Okay. A Marxist view of new social movements sees the state, the government, as entering more and more areas of private life in an effort to resolve the contradictions of late capitalist economies and the social injustices that are intended with them. Social movements are thus collective efforts to regain control of areas previously defined as private. The critique of this approach. This theory appropriately understands the vast power of the government to shape society and to shape people's lives. Critics claim there is no differences between these new social movements and the traditional ones, such as the women's movement or the other movements I just described. Okay. So again, these are the only ones. I know there's more movements. These are the only ones you need to know for the exam. They're all indicated on your review sheet. Also for the exam on page 654, there are the 4 stages in social movements, which are described by figure 24-2, and they're pretty straightforward. First, the movement emerges, then it coalesces and groups form around it, and then it becomes powerful and you develop offices and you phone banks. And so you look at, for example, the development of the National Organization of Women, which has offices and so forth. So that's the bureaucratization stage. And then eventually there's decline. All social movements face some level of decline. Okay. Social movements absolutely do cause social change, which in turn can lead to even more social movements because people see how effective they are. So the movements of the 60s were all inspired by the civil rights movement of the 50s, the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s. And so when students saw how effective those students were in leading those movements, it led to the emergence of the other social movements. Eric Hoffer said, social movements can begin with a belief in God, but never with a belief in the devil. I disagree. QAnon has a belief in the devil as inspiring, a lot of what's going on here. I have no idea who said it, but it's a great quote. If you pick up a starving dog and make him prosperous, he will not bite you. That is the principal difference between a man and a dog. Okay. Hey, that's all I got for chapter 24. When next we meet, I will go over the last chapter in the text and the final chapter you need to know anything about whatsoever for the exam. So take care for now, and I'll be seeing you soon.